Modern History of the Arab Countries. Vladimir Borisovich Lutsky, 1969. Chapter A. The Arab Countries during the 16th to the 18th century Turkish conquest. At the beginning of the 161 century, almost all the Arab countries were subjugated by the Turks and incorporated in the Ottoman state. In 1514, Sultan Selim I, the Cruel, led the Turkish army to conquer northern Iraq. In 1516, he wrested Syria and Palestine from the Egyptian Mamluks, and 1 year later routed the Mamluk army, destroyed the Mamluk state, and conquered Egypt and the Hejaz. The Turkish conquest of the Arab countries was continued by Sultan Suleiman I, the Lawgiver, the successor of Selim I. In 1520, the Turkish pirate Khaireddin Barbarossa declared himself the Turkish Sultan's vassal and conquered Algeria, and in 1533 the Sultan began sending officials from Constantinople to rule the country. In 1534, the Turks made their first attempt to conquer Tunisia. They were repulsed by the Spanish and did not gain complete possession of the country until 1574. In 1551, Turkey seized Tripoli. The Turkish expansion spread to the Arabian Peninsula. In 1532, the Turks conquered the Yemen and then the Somalian Red Sea coast. Mosul served as the starting point for their advance on southern Iraq. The age-old struggle between Turkey and Iran for the possession of Iraq ended in the victory of Turkey in 1638. After Iraq, the Turks conquered Al-Hassel on the shore of the Persian Gulf. Thus, within a period of about 100 years, almost all the Arab countries, except Morocco in the west and Inner Arabia and Oman on the Arabian Peninsula, were included in the Ottoman Empire and for some 3 or 4 centuries suffered Turkish oppression, which in the 19th and 20th centuries was replaced by the even harsher colonial yoke of the European capitalist powers. What was it that prompted the Ottoman feudalists to conquer the Arab countries? First, the desire to impose the feudal system of exploitation on the people. There was also the advantage to be gained from the Arab countries' position on the world trade routes. By controlling Algeria, Tunisia and Tripoli, the Ottoman feudalists could carry on extensive trade with the European countries. They could even squeeze out the Europeans and practice piracy on the Mediterranean. This was the era of the primary accumulation of capital, when piracy was part and parcel of sea trade. Lastly, Egypt, Syria and Iraq were very important centers of transit trade between Europe and the East, which, although it declined somewhat after the discovery of the direct sea route to India, round the Cape of Good Hope, still continued to yield large profits. The degree of subordination to the Ottoman Empire varied from country to country. Algeria, Tunisia and Tripoli were considered Ottoman provinces, but by the beginning of the 17th century they had already gained virtual independence from the Porte. In the middle of the 17th century, the Turks lost real power in the Yemen. Even in Syria, Palestine, Egypt and Iraq, where Turkish pashas were installed, the domination of the Porte was often only nominal. Either the pashas organized plots against the Sultan, or the local Arab feudal lords rose against the Turkish pashas, and from time to time fierce uprisings shook the Ottoman Empire. The social order of the Arab countries. Ottoman feudalism. Anxious to gain support in the Arab countries, the Turks, as a rule, preserved the social system that had existed before their conquest. The land and power remained in the hands of the local feudalists. The system of land ownership in the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire was very complicated. All land was divided into 3 basic groups. State land, Mamleket, the supreme owner of which was the Sultan; land belonging to religious establishments, Waqf; and privately owned land, Mulk. In addition, communal land ownership continued to exist in some countries. Land owned by individuals was relatively scarce. Its owners could dispose of it as they saw fit. The state collected only a land tax from the privately owned land. People had to pay either the ushr, about 1/10, or the carriage, which sometimes constituted half the harvest. The carriage varied according to the size of the harvest or was fixed according to the unit of area. Non-Muslims also paid a poll tax, jizya. As a rule, private land belonged to big feudal lords and was tilled by the peasants on the basis of the metayage system. Religious establishments owned large tracts of land. Ecclesiastical estates, waqfs, were formed by endowments and were exempt from taxation. The Muslim clergy was the mainstay of the feudal system, and in order to consolidate it, big feudal lords presented large estates to Muslim religious establishments, mosques, madrasas, collegiate mosques, dervish monasteries. It was not uncommon for small peasants to sacrifice their plots to religious establishments in order to save them from feudal usurpation. Usually these smallholders had the use of the land until the family died out. They had only to pay taxes to the religious establishment. The peasants on the ecclesiastical land, waqf, were no better off than under a feudal lord. At the time of the Turkish conquest, in some Arab countries there still existed communal ownership of land. Among the nomad herdsmen of North Africa, Iraq and Arabia, the pastures were owned in common by the Bedouin clans. In the settled farming areas, the fellahin communities periodically redistributed land among large families and individual households. In such countries, the Turkish conquerors pursued a policy of forced expropriation of the peasants' land. The communally owned land was declared state property and passed under the individual control of the clan nobility, the emirs and sheikhs. While abolishing communal land ownership, the Turkish conquerors often preserved the fellahin community as an appendage to the system of feudal exploitation. The whole community was held collectively responsible for the prompt payment of taxes. The community also saw to it that the lord's land was tilled. The most widespread category of land in the Ottoman Empire was the state land, which was divided into two groups, khaz and military fiefs. The khaz was a large estate with a revenue exceeding 100,000 akhaz. It either belonged to the sultan personally or was conferred on a prince or on a high dignitary as long as he held his post. Military fiefs were granted to the sipahi, knights, for life. The sipahi were exempt from state taxation. In return, they were obliged to provide first-class military service, regularly turn up at reviews and take part in campaigns with their cavalry. The number of horsemen depended on the amount of revenue received from the fief. Usually for every 3,000 akhaz one horseman had to be provided. The fiefs were divided into two groups according to their wealth. Military fiefs with a revenue of over 20,000 akhaz were called ziamets and their owners zaims. Fiefs with revenue of up to 20,000 akhaz were called timars and their owners timarji or timariads. If, during his lifetime, a sipahi conscientiously executed his military duties, his property passed to his sons after his death. They were given a new charter for which they paid redemption money to the treasury. The fief charter was on a strict class basis and was limited to the nobles. Each new sipahi was supposed to be supported by 2 zaims and 10 timariads. City dwellers were not granted fiefs. The land of the timars, ziamets and khaz was tilled by the peasants, who constituted the overwhelming bulk of the tax-paying population herd. They received a plot of land, shift, from the landlord, which they could pass on only with his permission. Virtually, the peasants were bound to the land. They had to fulfill all sorts of obligations, pay the ushur or the carriage and taxes for the use of winter and summer pastures, mills, for tobacco smoking, etc. The situation of the Christian raya was even worse. In addition, the Christians had to pay a jizya, poll tax or a carriage ra'asi. The military fief system was widespread in Asia Minor and on the Balkan Peninsula. It was not highly developed in the Arab countries except for the northern parts of Syria and Iraq. In the Aleppo and partly in the Mosul Elayates, the Turks introduced a system of military fief land ownership. In the other countries, the land remained mostly in the hands of the local feudal lords, who paid tribute to the sultan's deputies. In Egypt, on the whole, the system of feudal land ownership which had existed under the Mamluk sultans was preserved. All the land belonged to the feudal lords. Multazims, landowner tax farmers, the Turkish Pasha and the Muslim clergy. Formerly the land was considered state property but could be acquired by the Multazims. Many Multazims, the Nubian sheikhs, for instance, owned dozens of villages while some estates were split up between different owners to such a degree that there were several landlords in one village. Multazims were picked out from among the Turkish functionaries and officers as well as from the local Arab sheikhs. The Turkish rulers of Egypt inherited from the Mamluk sultans the custom of forming private guards from among the Mamluks, who had originally been slaves and were specially trained for military service. The Turkish beys appointed the Mamluks to important government posts and granted them large tracts of land. As a result, towards the end of the 18th century, two-thirds of Egypt's territory was concentrated in the hands of the Mamluks. They became the dominating stratum of the Egyptian feudal class. Multazims were exempt from military service but could be taxed. The taxes paid by the Multazims were entered in a special register kept by a special clerk, Defterder. If the tax was not paid on time, the estate was confiscated and given to a new owner. Land ownership was usually hereditary. In the Mamluk circle, the land was not passed on from father to son, but from the master to his favored slave. After the death of the owner, his heir was supposed to pay a large redemption sum to the treasury, 3-year rent plus 1/5 of the value of the land. In each iltizam, the estate of a multizim, the land was divided into two parts: the lord's land, or usia, and the allotted land, orator. The lord's land was tilled by the corvée system or, on very rare occasions, by hired labor. Allotted land was given to the peasants for life. The latter paid a money rent to the landlord in Lower Egypt and rent in kind in Upper Egypt. The rent in kind comprised from 20 to 35 ardebs of wheat from a harvest of 50 ardebs. If a peasant inherited a plot of land, he had to pay a large redemption sum to the multazim. The money rent, which was known as mal el-hur, was collected from the peasants by the multazims and divided into 3 unequal parts. One part was paid as tribute to the Porte. This part was delivered to the Pasha of Cairo and at the end of the 18th century amounted to 80 million medinas a year. Another part was used for the upkeep of the provincial administration. The administration was named Kashifia after the regional governors Kashifs. This amounted to 50 million medinas a year. These two amounts were fixed by law and subject to unconditional payment. The remaining part of the mal el-hur accrued to the multazims. In 1798, this amounted to 180 million medinas in cash, not counting payment in kind. But the landlords were still not satisfied with this sum. Besides mal el-hur, they levied barani, traditional janissary duties, at first as voluntary gifts in kind from the peasants, later, obligatory cash payments. In 1798, this tax yielded a sum of 100 million medinas. In addition, every village had to pay local taxes and duties. Taxes were collected by the village administration headed by a Makam, sub-governor, who was aided by the senior sheikh. Following the harvest every year a sarif, money changer, would turn up in the village. He was a city dweller, usually a Copt, who served the multazim landlord. He evaluated the harvest, determined the size of the tax and set to gathering it. As a reward for his services, the sarif collected an additional tax from the fellahin. Also included in the village administration were the wakil, the manager of the lord's land, the qali, land surveyor, who also directed public works, the masht, who carried out the functions of a policeman and also took part in flogging the fellahin, and the ghafiri watchman, who guarded the lord's granaries. As distinct from the officials of the Indian community listed by Marx, these were the landlord's servants, who maintained his economic and political authority over the direct producer, the fellah. As in Egypt, in Syria and the Lebanon, the conquerors preserved the feudal system. The land remained in the hands of the local Arab nobility, except for northern Syria. Under the Turks, The Lebanon was a kind of autonomous principality under the rule of the Mam dynasty. At the end of the 17th century, it came under the rule of the emirs of the Shahab family, who considered themselves the vassals of the Turkish Sultan and paid tribute to the Porte, but no Turkish troops were quartered there. There were similar principalities in Syria, for example, Latakia. The feudal society in the Lebanon, well described in K.M. Bazil's book, Syria and the Lebanon under Turkish rule, published in Russian, was hierarchical. This country was divided into three appanages: Kisruan, Matan and Shuf, administered by the local feudal dynasties. These appanages were in turn divided into smaller domains, and so on. A similar process occurred in the Latakia Principality and in southern Syria. At the head of the hierarchy stood the Turkish pashas, who had their seats at Aleppo, Damascus and Saida. They served as intermediaries between the Arab emirs and the Sultan. The feudal sovereign was the absolute ruler of his own land. The dependent emirs and sheikhs supplied horsemen for the ruler's army, collected taxes and paid tribute to him. All of them were incredibly rich. The Lebanese emir Fakhreddin II was reputed to be the richest man in the empire. His court was astonishingly sumptuous. His annual income was estimated at 900,000 livres, out of which he paid a tribute of 340,000 livres to the Turkish Sultan. Sheikh Zahir, who ruled in Safad in the 18th century, had an annual income of about £50,000. In the outlying districts of Syria and Palestine, there were survivals of the primitive communal system. These areas had been for long inhabited by numerous nomadic and settled tribes in which the slow process of feudalization was taking place. The tribal sheikhs, however, were still more like clan and tribal chiefs than feudal rulers. In Volney's description, 1784, of a tribal sheikh in southern Palestine, many survivals of the past are cited. The sheikh was in command of 500 horsemen, but at the same time he himself looked after the cattle, worked together with the members of his family, and so on. An important role was played by the spiritual feudals, the priests. In Syria, the Lebanon and Palestine, there were about 10 Christian and 5 Muslim denominations. Here feudal separatism was combined with spiritual separatism, and the political struggle often assumed a religious character. The higher clergy, especially the upper circles of the Maronite Church, owned vast tracts of land and along with the feudal lords exploited the peasantry. The formation of feudal relations in Iraq, where sharp differences existed between the north and the south, was peculiar. In the north of Iraq, the land was concentrated in the hands of the Kurdish Beks, who headed the Asharat tribes. Actually, these were big landowners, typical feudal lords under the cover of the clan. Sometimes, their domains extended over an area of tens of thousands of hectares. They recruited soldiers and paid tribute to the Turkish Sultan's deputies. In the south of Iraq, patriarchal relations prevailed. The land belonged to the Arab tribes and was considered their collective property. Many tribes settled down, combining land tillage with nomad cattle breeding. The Turkish authorities tried to liquidate collective ownership of the land. Community land was declared state property and handed over to the clan's elite. Attempts were made to turn the obligations of the tribal sheikhs into a hereditary duty which called for the approval of the authorities. Thus arose large Arab feudal families who owned huge tracts of land. These measures of the Turkish Sultan met with resistance from the ordinary tribesmen. Nomads and semi-nomads refused to pay rent. A conflict arose between the new feudal lords and the armed people which resulted in numerous uprisings of the Arab tribes. Often the new feudal lords were merely nominal owners of the land allotted to them. Almost the same process occurred in North Africa, where the Turks owned part of the land on the seaboard and carried on endless war against the Arab and Berber tribes who upheld their land rights. Everywhere in the Arab countries, big feudal land ownership went hand in hand with small-scale farming. In the form of huge taxes and requisitions, the landowners appropriated not only the surplus product, but the essential product as well, and did nothing to increase production. The economy was stagnant, and at its best was only able to ensure its own reproduction. Simple reproduction did not create any reserves in event of social or natural calamities. Frequent wars, feudal discord and droughts ruined the peasantry and brought about the decline of agriculture. Whole villages died out. Of the 3,200 villages that had existed around Aleppo in the 16th century, there were only about 400 left at the end of the 18th. The population either became extinct or fled to the cities. Conditions in Egypt were very bad. The rich Fayum Valley and the fertile plains of the Delta, so productive at the time of the reign of the pharaohs, Ptolemies, and even under the rule of the Romans, yield only 1/4 of what they used to, wrote Chabrol in his Transactions of the French Expedition. The cause of these deplorable changes is not far to seek. Nature is not to blame. The river is the same as before. Its periodic floods continue to fertilize the Nile Valley each year. But hope no longer encourages the farmer. He knows that the covetous intruder will reap the fruits of his sweat and blood. Why should he produce new crops if neither he nor his children are able to profit by them? He sows the land with disgust, reaps with fear, and tries to hide a meager share of the grain from the grasping oppressors to meet the needs of his family. In this unhappy country, the peasant owns no property and can never own any. He is not even a tenant. He is simply a serf of the clique oppressing his country. The process of the ruin of the peasantry, the dying out and depopulation of villages went on in all parts of the Ottoman Empire. The sultans endeavored to stop it by tying the peasant to the land. As far back as the 16th century, under Suleiman the Lawgiver, laws were passed to prevent the flight of peasants. The code of laws worked out by the Turks for Egypt, Canaan named Mizra, ordered the kashifs, the multazims and sheikhs, to see to it that not one plot of irrigated land remained uncultivated, to prevent the flight of the peasants, and to populate the ruined and empty villages with fellahin. If the peasant ran away from his plot, the sheikh was held materially responsible. The USIA could be sold only together with the fellahin who cultivated it. Famine, hard work, the corvée system, numerous taxes and duties, attachment to the land, the lack of rights, humiliation by the landlords and his servants — this was the lot of the Arab peasant. Often the fellahin, unable to endure the yoke any longer, rebelled. They were attacked by bands of Janissaries and their Arab hirelings who meted out severe reprisals. According to the codes of the lawgiver, no mercy was to be shown in dealing with peasant uprisings. The Arab city in the period of Ottoman rule. From the 16th to 18th centuries, Arab cities still bore the imprint of the Middle Ages. These seats of the Turkish beys and pashas were administrative rather than economic centers. But trade was already being carried on and craft production was developing. Ottoman rule in the East coincided with the revival and rapid growth of international trade. European industry was in need of additional markets. It found them in the vast Ottoman Empire. Turkish and Arab feudal lords bought English and Dutch cloth, French silks and wines, Russian furs and Bohemian cut glass. They exported to Europe grains, raw silk, skins, crude wool, fruits, nuts, olive oil, homespun yarn and cloth. Actually, this was the exchange of the raw materials exacted by the feudal lords from their producers as a rent in kind for foreign luxuries. The inhabitants of trading cities, Adam Smith wrote, by importing the improved manufactures and expensive luxuries of richer countries, afforded some food to the vanity of the great proprietors, who largely purchased them with great quantities of the rude produce of their lands. Karl Marx, Capital, Volume 3, Moscow, 1962, p. 323. The fatal consequences of such trade are obvious. It intensified the feudal exploitation of the peasantry and ruined the rural population. Adam Smith and Volney observed that Turkish trade proceeded on an unequal basis and caused great harm to the Ottoman Empire. One more peculiarity, as distinct from the Caliphate, For instance, the main role in this trade was played by foreign merchants. Who are the traders in Turkey? Engels wrote. Certainly not the Turks. Their way of promoting trade consisted in robbing caravans. Now that they are a little more civilized, it consists in all sorts of arbitrary and oppressive exactions. The Greeks, Armenians, Slavonians and the Franks established in the large seaports, carry on the whole of the trade and have absolutely no reason to thank the Turkish beys and pashas for being able to do so. Remove all the Turks out of Europe and trade will have no reason to suffer. F. Engels, The Turkish Question, New York Daily Tribune, April 19, 1853. Overseas commerce was concentrated at first mainly in the hands of the Italians, Venice, Genoa, Pisa, who were gradually squeezed out by English and French traders. They had their own quarters in large trading cities. There were European hotels and offices in Cairo, in the cities along the Syrian coast and in North African ports. During the 18th century, the English East India Company established trading stations in Baghdad and Basra. The Armenians, Greeks and, to some extent, the Arabs, acted as intermediaries and contractors for the European traders. They engaged in transit trade, the large centers of which were Cairo, Aleppo, Damascus, Baghdad, Trebizond and Constantinople. Persian carpets, Indian muslins, pearls, etc., came pouring in. Yemeni coffee was sent from Jeddah to Cairo, while from Sennar and Darfur came slaves, gold, ivory, musk, ostrich feathers. Through these cities local products were exported to the seaports and purchased by European traders. Internal trade was rather poorly developed, although centers of local exchange between town and country gradually began to grow, the wares of the town craftsmen usually being sold in the city at daily bazaars or annual fairs. There were two reasons for the predominance of Europeans in the trade of the Ottoman Empire. The first was that, by this time Europe had overtaken Turkey in both the cultural and economic fields. The European traders had large sums of capital behind them and much greater experience in commerce. Their organization of trade and transport of products was much better. In a word, they had a better trade culture. The second reason lay in the capitulation regime. Capitulations in the Ottoman Empire were certificates granting the European traders special rights and privileges. Originally, capitulations were privileges granted voluntarily and unilaterally by the Turkish Sultan to foreign traders and could be withdrawn at any minute. The first capitulations were granted to Italian traders in the 14th century, permitting them to settle in the cities of the Ottoman Empire, conduct trade and practice their religion. They contained deeds of property and determined the amount of duty the traders had to pay. In the 16th century, capitulations assumed the character of bilateral agreements. The first agreement of this kind was concluded in 1535 between Suleiman the lawgiver and Francis I, the King of France. The French not only obtained the right to trade, but many other privileges as well. The ships of other nations could enter Ottoman ports only under the protection of the French flag. French pilgrims were given free access to the holy places and were free to practice their religion. In 1604, similar agreements were concluded with the English and the Venetians, who began to trade with Turkey under their own flags. Gradually similar rights were extended to the subjects of other European powers. As the Ottoman Empire weakened, the European powers began to regard the capitulations as their irrefutable rights and tried to get them extended to include their local contractors as well. Thanks to the capitulations, the traders were exempt from taxation and from the jurisdiction of the Turkish courts. Their property could not be confiscated. The capitulation regime lasted till the 20th century, in Egypt, for example, until 1937 and was used by the European powers as an instrument for the colonial enslavement of the Arab countries. It undermined the development of national capital and placed the local traders in an unequal position. European traders paid a custom rate comprising 3% of the value of the product, The local traders paid from 7 to 10%. Taxes were imposed on foreign articles of merchandise only once, when they were imported into the country. Those of the local traders were taxed each time they passed through the numerous customs offices and each time they were moved from one feudal estate to another. Naturally, this hindered and undermined the development of capitalist relations in the Arab countries. As regards industry, the Ottoman Empire also lagged behind the advanced European countries, where the transition to manufacture and then to machine production was making headway. In the Ottoman Empire, however, guilds of handicraftsmen, asnaf, still predominated. In each guild there existed the same hierarchy as in Europe. At the head of each shop was a chief sheikh. Next came masters and apprentices. Each shop had its own traditions and customs. The largest centers of the crafts industry were Damascus and Aleppo in Syria, Baghdad and Mosul in Iraq, Cairo in Egypt, Tunis, Algiers, Tlemcen, Fez and Marrakesh in North Africa. The Arab handicraftsmen were famous for the production of cloth, carpets, morocco, weapons, copperware, etc. Up to the 18th century, many of their wares were exported to Europe. But from the time of the Industrial Revolution, local merchants were forced out even from the home markets. In the Arab countries, there was still no clear-cut division between the crafts and agriculture. In Egypt, for example, yarn was produced directly in the peasant household. The manufacture of woolen cloth remained the lot of the peasant women folk. The same conditions prevailed in the Lebanon. In Syria, in the province of Aleppo, not only woolen cloth but also cotton fabrics were produced. In the villages, on the other hand, many city inhabitants engaged in farming, especially market gardening. Damascus, for example, was buried in fruit and vegetable gardens. The social structure of the Arab towns indicates that a large proportion of the population was non-productive. Cairo at the end of the 18th century had a population of 300,000, 100,000 being adult males. Of these, 25,000 were artisans, 15,000 were workers and the remaining 60,000 were not productively occupied. These were soldiers, landlords, clergymen, traders and their servants. The servants alone numbered 30,000. Not all artisans were engaged in productive labor. The Cairo guilds included guilds for bathhouse attendants, hairdressers, jugglers, street singers and public speakers, mule and camel drivers, dancers and drummers. The Ottoman feudal system hampered the development of the Arab towns. The local traders could not compete with the Europeans who were protected by the capitulations regime. Even European trade had many obstacles to overcome. At sea the cargo vessels were subject to attacks from the corsairs, many of whom served the Turkish Sultan. Trade caravans were looted by deribes and their bands of robbers. Lines of communications in the Ottoman Empire were very bad. Goods were transported by pack animals. Each town had its own customs and commercial legislation, its taxes, weights and measures, and so on. All this on top of feudal robbery held up the development of trade and industry and made the transition to capitalist relations impossible. In reality, Engels wrote, "The Turkish domination, like any other Eastern domination, is incompatible with capitalist society. Surplus value is in no way ensured against the rapacious grip of the satraps and pashas. The first and main condition for the bourgeois enterprise is lacking the safety of the merchant's person and property." Marx and Engels, Works, Volume 22, 2nd Rus. ed. p. 33.